Welcome to Bedtime Express, where ancient history meets peaceful sleep. I'm your host, and tonight we're embarking on an epic journey through time. You're about to experience the remarkable true story of Hannibal's march, the Carthaginian terror. Before you fall asleep, please hit that like button, leave a comment telling us what you'd like to hear next, and subscribe to Bedtime Express for more hours of historical stories, ancient legends, and soothing narratives designed to help you sleep peacefully. Now get ready to follow the legendary general as he leads his army across the snow-covered Alps, commanding war elephants and thousands of soldiers in an impossible quest to conquer Rome. Discover his brilliant tactics, his devastating battles, and the unfolding drama of one of history's greatest military campaigns. But before we begin, I encourage you to get comfortable. Dim the lights, adjust your pillows, and let yourself settle in. This is your time to relax, to escape into history, and to drift gently towards sleep as these ancient tales unfold. Now, close your eyes, take a deep breath, and prepare yourself. The Alps await, and Hannibal's legend is about to come alive. Let's begin. Hannibal's March, the Carthaginian terror. Close your eyes now, and let us travel back through the mists of time, back more than 2,000 years, to the sun-drenched shores of ancient Carthage. Feel the warm Mediterranean breeze upon your face. Smell the salt air mixing with the scent of exotic spices from distant lands. Here, in this great city of merchants and sailors, our story begins. Carthage was a jewel upon the North African coast, a city of white limestone buildings that gleamed in the sunlight like polished ivory. Her harbors were filled with ships from every corner of the known world. Phoenician traders brought purple dyes and cedar wood. Egyptian vessels carried grain and papyrus. Greek merchants offered wine and olive oil. The city hummed with 1,000 different tongues, 1,000 different dreams. But Carthage had a rival, a growing power across the sea. Rome, that city of 7 hills, hungered for dominance over the Mediterranean world. The two great powers had already fought one terrible war, a conflict that lasted more than 20 years and left both nations bloodied and exhausted. Carthage had lost that war, lost her island of Sicily, and paid crushing tribute to the Romans. In the aftermath of defeat, a Carthaginian general named Hannibal Barca refused to accept his nation's humiliation. Hamilcar was a proud man, a fierce warrior who had never been defeated in battle during the First War with Rome. He watched his beloved Carthage brought low not by Roman valor, but by exhaustion and political weakness. The bitterness of this defeat burned in his heart like a slow fire. One day, when his eldest son was just 9 years old, Hamilcar prepared to depart for Spain. There he would build a new empire for Carthage, reclaim her lost glory, and prepare for the day when Carthage might face Rome again. The boy, eager and bright-eyed, begged his father to take him along on this great adventure. His name was Hannibal. Hamilcar looked down at his son, this child who would one day shake the very foundations of Rome. "Do you truly wish to come with me?" he asked. The boy nodded eagerly, his dark eyes shining with excitement. "Then come," said Hamilcar, "but first you must swear an oath." The general led young Hannibal to the temple, where the smoke of sacrifices rose toward the heavens. The stone walls were cool and dark, lit only by flickering oil lamps that cast dancing shadows across the ancient carvings. Before the altar of the gods, Hamilcar made his son place his small hand upon the sacred offering. "Swear," commanded the father, "that you will never be a friend to Rome." The boy's voice rang out clear and strong in that sacred space. "I swear it," said Hannibal. "I will never be a friend to Rome." And with those words, the fate of empires was set in motion. That childhood oath would echo through the centuries, would reshape the ancient world, would bring Rome itself to the very edge of destruction. Years passed like water flowing downstream. Young Hannibal grew to manhood in Spain, learning the arts of war from his father, and after Hamilcar's death in battle, from his brother-in-law Hasdrubal. He learned to ride before he could properly walk. He studied the strategies of Alexander the Great, that Macedonian conqueror who had swept across the known world. He learned Greek and the ways of different peoples. He became a soldier among soldiers, sharing their hardships, eating their simple food, sleeping on the ground wrapped in his cloak. The men loved him for this. Here was no pampered noble who commanded from a distance, but a warrior who would stand beside them in the shield wall, who would face the same dangers they faced. Hannibal was fearless in battle, thoughtful in counsel, generous in victory, and merciful to those who surrendered. By the time he was 26 years old, the army of Carthaginian Spain proclaimed him their commander. Hannibal stood now at the height of his powers, a man in his prime. He was not tall, but powerfully built, with the endurance of a wolf and the quickness of a cat. His face was strong and intelligent, marked by a prominent nose and eyes that seemed to see through deception and straight to the heart of things. He could go days without proper sleep when necessary, could endure heat and cold that broke lesser men. He was a master of languages, speaking Punic, Greek, Latin, and the tongues of various Spanish tribes. But it was his mind that was his greatest weapon. Hannibal could see a battlefield the way a master chess player sees the board, anticipating his opponent's moves, setting traps within traps, turning apparent weakness into devastating strength. He studied his enemies carefully, learning their tactics, their psychology, their fears and overconfidence. Where other generals saw only force meeting force, Hannibal saw deception, misdirection, and the subtle art of making the enemy defeat himself. In the spring of 218 BC, Hannibal stood before a map of the known world. War with Rome was coming again. The Romans had interfered with Carthaginian expansion in Spain, had made demands that could not be accepted. The merchant princes of Carthage trembled at the thought of another war, but Hannibal welcomed it. This was what he had been preparing for all his life, the fulfillment of his childhood oath. But how to fight Rome? The Romans controlled the seas now, their fleets patrolling the waters between Africa and Italy. A direct assault by sea would be suicide. No, Hannibal would have to find another way, a route no one expected, a path so difficult that the Romans would never believe he would attempt it. He would march to Italy by land, from Spain through southern Gaul, over the towering Alps, and down into the heart of Roman territory. It was mad. It was impossible. It was exactly what he intended to do. Hannibal gathered his army that spring, a remarkable collection of warriors from across the known world. There were Libyans from North Africa, tough infantry who had fought in countless campaigns. There were Spanish warriors, fierce horsemen, and skilled swordsmen from the Iberian tribes. There were Numidian cavalry, the finest light horsemen in the world, who could ride circles around any opponent. There were Balearic slingers, who could put a stone through a man's skull at 50 paces. In all, nearly 90,000 infantry, 12,000 cavalry, and 37 war elephants. Ah, the elephants. Let us pause for a moment to consider these magnificent beasts. They were North African elephants, smaller than their Indian cousins, but still impressive, standing 10 feet tall at the shoulder. Each elephant was a living tank, capable of trampling infantry and terrifying cavalry horses. Their handlers, the mahouts, had trained them since birth, forming bonds that would endure through the hardships to come. In May, the Great March began. Hannibal left his brother Hasdrubal to defend Spain and led his massive army northward. The soldiers marched in long columns, their armor glinting in the Spanish sunday. Behind them came wagons loaded with supplies, siege equipment, spare weapons. The elephants swayed along, patient and steady, their massive feet raising dust from the ancient roads. The army crossed the Ebro River in late spring, entering territory that was contested between Carthaginian and Roman influence. Here, some of the Spanish tribes opposed their passage, and Hannibal was forced to fight several sharp actions to clear his path. He could not afford to leave hostile forces behind him, threatening his supply lines and communication with Carthage. So he fought when necessary, negotiated when possible, and always kept moving north. Summer came, bringing with it scorching heat and dusty roads. The soldiers marched through it all, their feet becoming hardened, their bodies lean and tough. They forded rivers, climbed hills, passed through forests where the sun barely penetrated the canopy. At night, they made camp in the ancient way, digging ditches and raising earthen ramparts, posting sentries to watch for enemies in the darkness. Hannibal was everywhere among his men, riding up and down the column on his Spanish charger. He would stop to share a joke with the Numidian cavalry, discuss tactics with his infantry commanders, check on the elephants' health with their mahouts. The men saw that he cared about them, that he shared their hardships, and they loved him for it. They would follow this man anywhere, even to the ends of the earth. By late summer, the army reached the Pyrenees, that great mountain range that separates Spain from Gaul. Here, Hannibal made a crucial decision. Some of his troops, particularly those from the Spanish tribes, were growing uneasy about the long march ahead. They had signed up to fight in Spain, not to venture into unknown lands far from home. Rather than force reluctant soldiers to continue, Hannibal dismissed them, sending perhaps 10,000 men back to Spain. It was a stroke of genius. Better to have a smaller army of willing warriors than a larger force filled with malcontents and deserters. The men who remained knew that they were the chosen ones, the volunteers, the true believers in Hannibal's vision. Their morale actually increased despite the reduction in numbers. The crossing of the Pyrenees took several weeks, but these were gentle mountains compared to what lay ahead. The army descended into southern Gaul in early autumn, entering a land of Celtic tribes who eyed these foreign soldiers with suspicion and wonder. Here, Hannibal's diplomatic skills proved as important as his military abilities. He met with tribal chieftains, offering gifts and promises, forming alliances where he could. Some tribes agreed to let him pass peacefully. Others demanded tribute, which Hannibal paid. Still others, particularly those allied with Rome, tried to block his path, and these he crushed with swift, brutal efficiency. The Gauls quickly learned that it was better to be this Carthaginian's friend than his enemy. The army marched along the Mediterranean coast, then turned inland, heading toward the Rhone River. This was a formidable obstacle, wide and swift-flowing, impossible to ford with a large army. Hannibal sent scouts ahead to find a suitable crossing point and to gather boats and rafts from the local Gauls. When the army reached the Rhone in late September, they found the opposite bank lined with hostile tribesmen, warriors who had been stirred up by Roman agents. The Gauls jeered and shook their weapons, confident that they could prevent the crossing. But Hannibal was not so easily deterred. Under cover of darkness, he sent a strong detachment of troops upstream with native guides. They marched for a day and a half, found a narrow point where the river could be forded, and crossed to the far side. Then they turned downstream, moving into position behind the hostile Gauls. At dawn, Hannibal began his crossing. The boats and rafts were loaded with soldiers and pushed out into the current. The Gauls on the far bank roared their defiance, preparing to slaughter the Carthaginians as they landed. But suddenly, smoke rose behind them. Hannibal's flanking force had arrived and set fire to the Gallic camp. Confusion spread through the Gallic ranks. They turned to face this new threat, and in that moment of distraction, the first Carthaginian boats reached the shore. The Numidian cavalry plunged into the river on their horses, swimming the animals across with practiced skill. Within hours, the entire army had crossed, and the Gauls had fled into the forest. But the elephants remained on the far bank. These great beasts were terrified of water and refused to enter the river. Hannibal's engineers constructed massive rafts, covering them with earth, so they looked like an extension of the river bank. The elephants were led onto these floating platforms, and only when the rafts were untied from shore did they realize they were on the water. Some of the elephants panicked, breaking free and falling into the river. But elephants are natural swimmers, and they made their way across, walking along the river bottom with their trunks raised above the water like snorkels. The sight of those massive grey shapes moving through the water must have been extraordinary, something from a dream or a legend. With the entire army safely across the Rhone, Hannibal allowed his men a few days' rest. They had been marching for 4 months now, covering over 700 miles, and autumn was well advanced. Soon, the weather would turn, and the real challenge would begin. It was here, at the Rhone, that Hannibal received visitors. Representatives of the Boii, a Gallic tribe from northern Italy, came to his camp with news and promises. They hated the Romans, they said, who had been pushing northward, seizing Gallic lands and subjugating the tribes. If Hannibal came to Italy, the Gauls would rise up and join him. They would provide food, shelter, and warriors for his army. Hannibal listened carefully, weighing their words. Were they sincere, or was this some Roman trick? He questioned them closely, and their knowledge of northern Italy seemed genuine. More importantly, they brought guides who claimed to know the passes through the Alps. This was invaluable intelligence. The Carthaginian general made his decision. They would continue. They would cross the Alps before winter closed the passes. He gathered his army and told them of the challenges ahead, but also of the rewards. In Italy, he promised they would find rich lands to plunder, Roman allies to detach from Rome, and glory beyond imagining. The men cheered, their voices echoing across the plains of Gaul. In early October, with autumn already turning the leaves gold and crimson, Hannibal's army turned toward the mountains. Ahead of them, rising like a great wall against the sky, stood the Alps. These were the highest mountains in Europe, peaks that scraped the clouds, passes that were buried in snow for much of the year. No army had ever crossed them before. But Hannibal would be the first. The great march northward had taken its toll. The army that now approached the Alps numbered perhaps 50,000 infantry and 9,000 cavalry. Many men had been left behind as garrisons, or had deserted, or had fallen in skirmishes with hostile tribes. But those who remained were hardened veterans, men who had proven their loyalty and endurance. They would need every ounce of that strength for what lay ahead. Let your breathing slow now, matching the pace of those ancient soldiers as they marched toward their destiny. Feel the weight of armor on weary shoulders, the dust of the road in your throat, the anticipation and fear mingling in your chest. The greatest challenge still lay before them, a test that would separate the worthy from the weak, the determined from the doubtful. And somewhere beyond those distant peaks lay Italy, Rome, and the fulfillment of an oath sworn by a child in a temple long ago. The foothills of the Alps rose before Hannibal's army like the first gentle waves before a tsunami. At first, the going was not so difficult. The valleys were wide and green, dotted with the stone huts of Gallic tribes who herded cattle and sheep in these upland meadows. The rivers here were clear and cold, fed by mountain springs and snowmelt from the peaks above. The soldiers could still imagine this was simply another march, another campaign like those they had fought in Spain. But Hannibal knew better. He had questioned the Gallic guides extensively, had listened to their descriptions of the passes above. He knew that the easy part would not last. Still, he maintained an air of confidence, riding among his troops with a smile, pointing out the beauty of the mountains, making light of the journey ahead. A commander must always show confidence, even when uncertainty gnaws at his heart. The first real obstacle came after several days of climbing. The path narrowed, winding through a gorge where steep cliffs rose on either side. It was here that the Allobroges, a local Gallic tribe, had positioned themselves. These mountain people knew every path and pass in these highlands, and they had decided that this Carthaginian army represented both a threat and an opportunity. The Allobroges held the heights above the narrow pass, and from their vantage point, they could rain down boulders and spears on anyone trying to move through the gorge below. It was a perfect ambush position, nearly impregnable. When Hannibal's scouts reported this obstacle, many of his officers counseled finding another route. But the Carthaginian general had other ideas. Hannibal sent messengers to the Allobroges, seeking to negotiate safe passage. The tribal chieftains agreed to meet, and after much discussion, they seemed willing to let the army pass in exchange for tribute. They even offered guides and hostages as a show of good faith. But Hannibal's keen mind detected something false in their manner, some calculation behind their apparent cooperation. He questioned the Gallic guides he had brought from the Rhone, and they confirmed his suspicions. The Allobroges, they said, were treacherous mountain bandits who made their living by robbing travelers. They would agree to anything, then attack when the army was strung out and vulnerable in the narrow pass. It was their way. Very well, thought Hannibal. If they wished to play the game of deception, he would show them how a master played. He accepted the Allobroges' offer, thanked them for their cooperation, and made camp at the entrance to the gorge. But that night, under cover of darkness, he led a picked force of his best soldiers up the mountainside by a hidden path. It was hard, dangerous climbing in the darkness. The men had to feel their way along narrow ledges, hauling themselves up rocky slopes, trying to make no sound that would alert the enemy. One misstep would send a man tumbling down the mountainside to his death is less than #0. 5# is greater than. But these were veteran soldiers, men who had trained for years, and they trusted their commander absolutely. By dawn, Hannibal's force had gained the heights above the Allobroges' position. At the same time, the main Carthaginian army began moving through the gorge below. The Allobroges, thinking themselves clever, waited until the column was well committed to the pass, then sprang their ambush. They rolled boulders down from above, threw spears, and prepared to descend and finish off the disordered Carthaginians. But then war cries echoed from above them, and suddenly they were the ones being attacked. Hannibal's soldiers fell upon the Allobroges from behind, driving them toward the cliff edge. The ambushers became the ambushed, and many of them died there on the rocks or plunged screaming into the gorge below. The survivors fled into the mountains, and the pass was clear. The army moved through quickly, though not without losses. Several pack animals had been startled by the falling rocks and had tumbled over the edge, carrying valuable supplies with them. Some soldiers had been injured by the bombardment, but the army was intact, and they had won their first victory against the mountains themselves. For 3 more days, they climbed higher into the Alps, following paths that became ever more narrow and treacherous. The air grew thin and cold, making every breath a labor. The soldiers from Africa and Spain, used to warm climates, suffered in the chill winds that swept down from the peaks. They wrapped themselves in whatever extra clothing they had, but still they shivered as they marched. The elephants too were suffering. These great beasts were designed for the warmth of Africa, not the cold of alpine heights. Their mahouts did what they could, covering them with blankets, urging them forward with gentle words and prodding hooks. The elephants trudged on, patient and uncomplaining, but their eyes held a sad, bewildered look, as if they could not understand why their humans had brought them to this terrible place. Then came the city of the Centrones, a Gallic settlement perched on a mountainside. As Hannibal's army approached, the inhabitants came out bearing olive branches and leading cattle and sheep. They offered these gifts freely, they said, wanting only to live in peace with these powerful strangers. They would even provide guides to lead the army through the highest passes. Hannibal's officers were pleased, but the general himself remained wary. He had been deceived once already in these mountains, and he studied the Centrones carefully, looking for signs of treachery. They seemed genuine enough, but something in their manner troubled him. Nevertheless, he accepted their offer, though he made sure to keep the most influential men as hostages and assigned guards to watch the Centrone guides carefully. His caution proved justified. For 2 days, the guides led them higher into the mountains, and on the afternoon of the second day, they reached another narrow gorge. The path here was barely wide enough for a single wagon, with a sheer cliff rising on one side and a deadly drop on the other. As the vanguard of the army entered this defile, the Centrones attacked. They came from above and from behind, thousands of mountain warriors who knew every rock and path. They hurled stones and spears, pushed boulders down onto the trapped column below. The noise was tremendous, the crash of falling rocks mixing with the screams of wounded men and panicked animals. Horses reared and plunged over the cliff edge. Soldiers fell with Gallic spears through their bodies. It was chaos, a nightmare in the narrow space of that mountain pass. The elephants, those gentle giants, became a liability in the confined space. They could not turn around, could not fight effectively, and their presence blocked the path, preventing reinforcements from reaching the front. Some of them, maddened by fear and pain, tried to climb the mountainside and fell, tumbling down the slope in a terrible cascade of gray flesh and breaking bone. But Hannibal was with the vanguard, and he quickly took control of the situation. He sent his Numidian cavalry back along a parallel path to attack the Centrones from an unexpected angle. He ordered his Spanish infantry to form a tight defensive formation, overlapping their shields to create a moving fortress that pushed slowly through the ambush. And he himself stood in the thick of the fighting, his sword bloody, his voice steady, rallying his men by his presence. The battle lasted for hours, but gradually the Carthaginians fought their way through the pass. The Numidians caught the Centrones from behind and slaughtered many of them. The rest fled back into the mountains, carrying their wounded with them. When Hannibal finally led his army out of the gorge and into a wider valley, he ordered a count of his losses. The numbers were sobering. Perhaps 1,000 men had been killed or had fallen over the cliffs. Many pack animals were gone, taking with them vital supplies of food and equipment. Several elephants had been lost, though most had survived. More troubling than the losses, though, was the effect on morale. The soldiers began to whisper among themselves, questioning whether this mad enterprise was worth the cost. Hannibal gave them no time to dwell on their fears. The next day, he led a swift raid on the Centrone stronghold, a fortified town higher in the mountains. The attack was fierce and merciless, and the town fell in a matter of hours. The Carthaginians took revenge for their fallen comrades and, more importantly, captured enough grain and cattle to feed the army for several days. Victory, even a small one, restored the soldiers' spirits. Now came the hardest part of the journey. The guides, questioned under duress, revealed that the highest pass was still ahead, a place where the path became little more than a track of ice and snow, where the cold could kill as surely as any enemy's spear. It was late October now, and winter was closing in. Every day they delayed increased the risk that they would be caught by a major snowstorm and trapped in the mountains until spring. Hannibal ordered the army to rest for one day, to gather their strength for the final push. He moved among the campfires that night, talking with his soldiers, sharing their food, listening to their concerns. He reminded them of why they had come, of the wealth and glory that awaited them in Italy, of the oath they had all taken to see this through to the end. "Look at what we have already accomplished," he told them, his voice carrying through the cold night air. "We have marched 1,000 miles from New Carthage. We have crossed rivers that men said could not be crossed, defeated tribes that men said could not be defeated. And now we stand on the very roof of the world, and one more pass lies before us. One more day of hardship, and then we descend into Italy, where the Romans wait in their comfortable cities, never dreaming that we could reach them. Will you turn back now when we are so close?" The soldiers roared their defiance at the mountains. No, they would not turn back. They would follow Hannibal wherever he led, even into the land of eternal ice and snow if necessary. The Carthaginian general nodded, satisfied. These men would not fail him. At dawn, the army began the ascent to the highest pass. The path here was covered in old snow, compacted by previous travelers but still treacherous. The soldiers had to help each other along, forming human chains to prevent anyone from slipping over the edge. The pack animals struggled, their hooves slipping on the ice, and several fell despite the soldiers' best efforts to save them. The cold was intense, a dry, biting cold that seemed to suck the warmth from a man's body. Soldiers who had marched through the heat of Spain and Africa now saw their breath freeze in the air before them. Their fingers and toes went numb despite wrappings of cloth. Some men developed frostbite, their extremities turning white, then black. The elephants suffered terribly. Each step was agony for these massive creatures, their feet not designed for ice and snow. They moved slowly, painfully slowly, and the mahouts wept to see their beloved charges in such distress. But the elephants kept moving, kept climbing, driven by their training and their trust in the humans who had cared for them since they were calves. The sun, when it appeared, was pale and distant, offering little warmth. The sky was a hard, brilliant blue, so bright it hurt the eyes. All around them, peaks of white and grey stretched in every direction, an endless landscape of stone and ice that seemed utterly lifeless, utterly indifferent to the struggles of these tiny humans and their animals. Late in the afternoon, they reached the summit of the pass. Hannibal ordered a halt, and the army gathered on a relatively flat area near the top. The wind here was fierce, howling around the peaks like a living thing, trying to push them all off the mountain. But the view was extraordinary. To the north, behind them, they could see the way they had come, valley after valley stretching back toward Gaul, now dim with distance and the gathering dusk. And to the south, laid out below them like a promised land, they could see the plains of Italy. Hannibal stood at the highest point, his cloak whipping in the wind, and pointed down at that distant view. "There," he shouted over the howling wind, "there lies Italy. There lie the rich cities of Rome and her allies. We have conquered the mountains, my brothers. Now we shall conquer Rome herself." The soldiers, exhausted as they were, raised a ragged cheer that was torn away by the wind. But their ordeal was not yet over. They camped that night on the pass, huddling together for warmth, burning whatever wood they had carried with them. It was a miserable night, perhaps the worst of the entire journey. The wind never stopped, and men who fell asleep too far from the fires did not wake up, their bodies frozen where they lay. The elephants stood in a tight group, pressing against each other, their trunks wrapped around their tusks for warmth. At first light, they began the descent, and here they discovered that going down could be even more treacherous than climbing up. The southern side of the pass was steeper than the northern approach, and recent snow had covered a layer of ice, making the path impossibly slippery. Men who tried to walk down fell and slid, often going over the edge into the abyss below. After losing dozens of soldiers this way, Hannibal called a halt. He sent his engineers to examine the path ahead, and they brought back grim news. Not only was the path covered in ice, but there had been a landslide at some point, and part of the trail had simply disappeared, leaving a gap that would need to be rebuilt before the army could pass. The engineers set to work immediately, using whatever tools they had, working in teams to keep from freezing. They began to construct a new section of path. They cut steps into the ice, laid logs across gaps, built up sections of trail with rocks and earth. It was slow, brutal work, made all the more difficult by the cold and the altitude. The army waited, trapped on the mountainside, for 3 days while the engineers worked. During this time, the soldiers consumed the last of their rations. Hunger joined cold as their enemy. Some men talked of eating the pack animals, or even the elephants, but Hannibal forbade it. They would need those animals when they reached Italy. Finally, the path was passable, at least for the infantry and cavalry. the soldiers began to descend, moving slowly and carefully, holding on to each other, inching down the icy slope. But the elephants could not manage it. Their huge feet could find no purchase on the ice, and the first one that tried to descend slipped and fell, sliding down the mountainside until it went over the edge, its trumpet of fear echoing through the peaks. Hannibal refused to lose any more of these magnificent creatures. He ordered his engineers to widen and strengthen the path, a task that took another 4 days. During this time, the army was split, with most of the soldiers camped lower down where there was grazing for the horses and the remaining pack animals, while Hannibal and a small force stayed with the elephants on the heights. It was during these days that Hannibal showed why his men loved him so deeply. He could have gone down with the main army, could have waited in relative comfort while others did the hard work. Instead, he stayed with the engineers and the mahouts, working alongside them, his own hands blistered and bleeding from moving rocks and cutting ice. He shared the last scraps of food with the men, gave his own cloak to a soldier who was shivering uncontrollably. When the path was finally ready, the elephants were led down one at a time, moving slowly, carefully, with ropes tied around them so that soldiers could help control their descent. It took an entire day to get all the remaining elephants down, but when it was done, not one more had been lost. The mahouts wept with relief, and even the hardened soldiers cheered as the last great beast reached the bottom. Now the descent became easier. The path widened, the ice gave way to snow, the snow to mud, the mud to grass. Trees appeared again, first stunted pines, then larger oaks and chestnuts. The air grew warmer and thicker with each step down. The soldiers could hardly believe they had survived, that they had actually crossed the Alps. But the ordeal had taken a terrible toll. Of the 50,000 infantry that had begun the crossing, perhaps 26,000 emerged into Italy. Of 9,000 cavalry, only 6,000 remained. They had lost hundreds of pack animals and more than half their elephants. The survivors were gaunt and haunted, their faces weathered by wind and cold, their eyes holding memories of horrors seen on the mountain. Yet they had done it. They had accomplished what the Romans thought impossible. They had crossed the Alps, brought an army into Italy from an unexpected direction, and now they stood on Roman soil, ready to bring war to the very heart of the Republic. It was now early November of 218 BC. The journey from New Carthage had taken nearly 6 months, but Hannibal had kept his promise. He had brought his army to Italy, and now the Romans would learn what terror truly meant. Let yourself drift now, feeling the relief of those ancient soldiers as they descended into warmer lands. Feel the sun on your face again, the grass beneath your feet, the taste of fresh water from a mountain stream. They had been through hell and emerged on the other side, transformed by their ordeal into something harder, something unbreakable. and ahead of them lay the rich lands of Italy, unsuspecting, unprepared, waiting to be conquered. The Po Valley stretched before Hannibal's army like a vision of paradise after the nightmare of the mountains. This was the land called Cisalpine Gaul, the region of Italy north of the Apennines, where Celtic tribes had settled centuries before and made it their own. The land here was flat and fertile, crossed by rivers and dotted with prosperous towns. Fields of grain ripened under the autumn sun, orchards heavy with fruit lined the roads, and cattle grazed in lush meadows. The first task was to recover. Hannibal made camp near the lands of the Taurini, a Gallic tribe that had been at war with the Insubres, another Celtic people who had already allied with Carthage. The Taurini were hostile, and Hannibal could not afford to leave an enemy in his rear. Despite the exhaustion of his troops, he besieged and captured the Taurini's capital in just 3 days, making an example of those who resisted. The message was clear: join Hannibal or face destruction. Word of the Carthaginians' arrival spread quickly through the region. The Gallic tribes of northern Italy, the Insubres, the Boii, and others, had been suffering under Roman expansion for years. Roman colonies had been planted in their lands. Roman soldiers had fought to subdue them. Roman law had been imposed upon their ancient customs. Now here was a foreign army, an enemy of Rome, and many Gauls saw in Hannibal their chance for revenge and liberation. Young Gallic warriors began to arrive at Hannibal's camp, bringing weapons and enthusiasm. They were not the disciplined soldiers of Carthage's army, but they were fierce fighters who knew the land and hated Rome with a passion. Hannibal welcomed them, knowing that he would need numbers to replace the men lost in the mountains. Within weeks, his army had swelled to nearly 40,000 men. But the Romans were not idle. In Rome itself, the Senate was in an uproar when news arrived that Hannibal had crossed the Alps. It seemed impossible, like a nightmare come to life. They had thought themselves safe, protected by the sea and the mountains, and now an enemy army stood on Italian soil. 2 Roman armies were already in the field. The consul Publius Cornelius Scipio had been sailing for Spain to intercept Hannibal when he received news that the Carthaginian had already crossed into Gaul. Scipio had landed at Massilia and attempted to catch Hannibal at the Rhone, but he arrived too late. Now he sent his army onto Spain under his brother's command and took a small force back to Italy by sea, racing to intercept Hannibal before he could cause too much damage. Scipio was a capable commander, a member of one of Rome's most distinguished families. He had fought in the First Punic War and understood the Carthaginians. He gathered what forces he could in northern Italy, including 2 Roman legions and allied troops, perhaps 26,000 men in all. It was a smaller army than Hannibal's, but these were Roman legionaries, the best heavy infantry in the world. men who had conquered half of Italy through discipline and courage. The two armies met in late November near the Ticinus River, a tributary of the Po. Both commanders were conducting reconnaissance with their cavalry when they unexpectedly encountered each other. What began as a patrol contact quickly escalated into a full cavalry battle. The Roman cavalry was adequate but not exceptional, made up of the aristocratic young men of Rome and their Italian allies. They fought in the traditional manner, with javelins and swords, expecting a straightforward clash of horsemen. But Hannibal's cavalry was something different entirely. The Numidian horsemen were among the finest light cavalry in the world. They rode without saddles or bridles, controlling their horses with voice and knee pressure, leaving their hands free to throw javelins with devastating accuracy. They could ride circles around heavier cavalry, harassing and weakening them before closing for the kill. And Hannibal's Spanish cavalry, heavy horsemen with long swords and small shields, were shock troops who could smash through an enemy line with the force of their charge. Combined with the Numidians, they formed a perfectly balanced cavalry force that could adapt to any situation. The Battle of the Ticinus was brief but decisive. Hannibal's cavalry enveloped the Roman horse, attacking from multiple directions at once. The Romans fought bravely, but they were outmatched and outnumbered. In the thick of the fighting, Consul Scipio himself was wounded, struck by a javelin, and only saved when his teenage son rallied a group of soldiers to rescue him. That boy was the younger Publius Cornelius Scipio, who would one day take the name Africanus and become Hannibal's greatest enemy. The Roman cavalry broke and fled, and Scipio, wounded and knowing he was outmatched, withdrew his army across the Po River, destroying the bridges behind him. It was the first Roman defeat, a small one perhaps, but significant. The invincibility of Rome had been challenged, and the Gallic tribes took note. More Gauls flocked to Hannibal's banner after the Ticinus. Some came as individuals, others as entire warrior bands with their chieftains. They brought food from their farms, information about Roman movements, and most importantly, a burning desire to strike back at Rome. Hannibal accepted them all, though he was careful to integrate them with his veteran troops, knowing that undisciplined warriors could be as dangerous to their own side as to the enemy. Scipio, meanwhile, fell back to the Trebia River, where he was joined by the other consul, Tiberius Sempronius Longus, who had been recalled from Sicily with his army. Together, they now commanded about 40,000 men, roughly equal to Hannibal's force. Sempronius was eager for battle, wanting to win glory before his term as consul ended at the year's close. Scipio, wiser and wounded, counseled patience and caution. But Hannibal understood Roman politics and psychology. He knew that Sempronius would be eager to fight, and he set about creating the circumstances that would force a battle on his terms. He sent raiding parties to attack Roman allies, burning farms and capturing supplies. Each raid was calculated to provoke Sempronius, to make him angry and careless. It was now late December, and winter had truly arrived. Snow fell intermittently, and the Trebia River ran cold and swift with meltwater from the mountains. Hannibal studied the ground carefully, noting the terrain, the river, the location of the Roman camp, and then he prepared his trap. He sent his brother Mago with 2,000 picked men, both infantry and cavalry, to hide in a ravine near the battlefield. They went at night, carrying only their weapons, and concealed themselves in the brush and tall grass. Then, at dawn, Hannibal sent his Numidian cavalry to attack the Roman outposts, harassing the guards, throwing javelins, and then retreating. Sempronius, as Hannibal had hoped, took the bait. He ordered his army out immediately, without even stopping to let the soldiers eat breakfast. 40,000 men rushed from their warm camps into the cold dawn, crossing the Trebia's icy waters, soaking themselves to the waist in their eagerness to catch the raiding Numidians. On the far side of the river, they found Hannibal's army waiting for them, deployed in battle order on ground of his choosing. The Carthaginian soldiers had eaten a hot breakfast, had rubbed oil into their muscles to keep warm, and were ready for battle. The Romans were cold, wet, and hungry, but they were Romans, and they did not fear any enemy. The two armies closed with each other across a snowy plain. In the center, the Roman legions advanced in their famous checkerboard formation, the maniples of Hastati, Principes, and Triari, moving forward with precision. These were professional soldiers, men who had trained all their lives for this moment, and they crashed into Hannibal's African and Spanish infantry with tremendous force. For a time, the center of the battlefield was a brutal stalemate. Romans and Carthaginians locked shields and pushed, stabbed, died, and were replaced by the men behind them. The snow turned red with blood. Men slipped on the frozen ground, only to be trampled by those coming behind. It was war in its most primitive form, strength against strength, will against will. But on the wings, Hannibal's cavalry had done their work. The Roman horse, already weakened at the Ticinus, was no match for the combined force of Numidians and Spaniards. They broke almost immediately, fleeing the field and leaving the Roman infantry's flanks exposed. Still the legions fought on, their discipline holding even as the Carthaginian cavalry began to circle around behind them. The center of the Roman line actually pushed forward, driving back Hannibal's Gallic troops. For a moment, it seemed the Romans might win through sheer determination and courage. Then Mago sprang his ambush. 2,000 fresh soldiers emerged from the ravine and fell upon the Roman rear. At the same time, Hannibal's elephants, which had been held in reserve, were sent crashing into the Roman flanks. The legions, attacked from 3 sides at once, began to break apart. Most of the Roman army was slaughtered in the snow or drowned trying to recross the Trebia in retreat. But about 10,000 legionaries in the center, the best and bravest of the Roman troops, cut their way through Hannibal's Gauls and escaped intact, marching in formation to the city of Placentia, where they would form the core of a new army. The Battle of the Trebia was a devastating Roman defeat. An entire consular army had been destroyed. Thousands of Rome's best soldiers lay dead in the snow, and the myth of Roman invincibility had been shattered. More importantly, the battle demonstrated Hannibal's genius for tactics and his understanding of his enemy's psychology. Winter closed in after the Trebia, and Hannibal made camp in the Po Valley, giving his men time to rest and recover. He treated the Gallic tribes well, paying for food and supplies rather than simply taking them, and more tribes joined his alliance. His army grew to perhaps 50,000 men, though many were Gauls of uncertain discipline and loyalty. In Rome, there was something approaching panic. The Senate debated frantically about how to stop this Carthaginian invasion. Some called for raising more legions, others for seeking peace, still others for recalling the armies from Spain and Sicily. But in the end, Roman pride and determination won out. They would fight, they would raise new armies, and they would drive this foreign invader from Italian soil. Spring came early in the year 217 BC, and with it, Hannibal began his march south. He could not stay in the north forever, living off the Gauls' hospitality. He needed to strike at the heart of Roman power, to detach Rome's Italian allies and bring the Republic to its knees. And so the army moved out, following the ancient road southward toward central Italy and Rome itself. The route Hannibal chose was unexpected and difficult. Rather than taking the coastal road, which would have been easy but well defended, he chose to cross the Apennine Mountains and then traverse the swamps of the Arno River in Etruria. It was early spring, and the snowmelt had turned these marshes into a vast, fetid lake. The army marched through the swamps for 4 days and 4 nights without rest. The water was often waist deep, and there was nowhere dry to sleep or make camp. Men and animals died of exhaustion, drowning, or disease. Hannibal himself contracted an infection in his eye, perhaps from the filthy water, and despite his physician's best efforts, he lost the sight in that eye forever. From this point forward, he would see the world through a single eye, like a cyclops of legend. More elephants died in the swamps, their great feet sinking in the mud, their bodies too heavy to pull free. By the time the army emerged into the clear lands of Etruria, only one elephant remained, a massive bull that had survived every hardship of the journey. Hannibal took this as a sign and rode this elephant into battle from that day forward, a deliberate piece of psychological warfare designed to awe and terrify his enemies. The army that came out of the swamps was a shadow of what had crossed the Alps. Many soldiers had died, others had deserted, and those who remained were exhausted and sick. But they were also veterans now, hardened by every imaginable hardship, men who had looked death in the face so many times that they no longer feared it. These soldiers would follow Hannibal anywhere, would do anything he asked, because they knew he would never ask them to do anything he wouldn't do himself. In Etruria, Hannibal began a systematic campaign of devastation. His army swept through the countryside, burning farms, capturing livestock, destroying crops. It was not mindless destruction, but calculated policy. He wanted to force the Romans to fight him, to draw them out of their fortified cities and into open battle where his tactical genius could overcome their numerical superiority. And he wanted to show Rome's Italian allies that their protector could not protect them. If the Romans would not fight to defend their allies' lands, what value was the Roman alliance? Perhaps these cities and tribes would be better off joining Hannibal, who at least seemed capable of winning battles. The Romans, meanwhile, had elected new consuls for the year 217 BC. One was Gnaeus Servilius Geminus, a cautious and experienced commander. The other was Gaius Flaminius, a popular politician who had risen through the ranks despite the opposition of the conservative nobility. Flaminius was brave and energetic, but he lacked military experience at this level, and he was eager to prove himself. Flaminius was given command of an army of about 25,000 men and ordered to stop Hannibal's rampage through Etruria. He marched his legions quickly, trying to intercept the Carthaginians, but Hannibal always seemed to be one step ahead, appearing where he wasn't expected, disappearing when the Romans approached. Finally, in June of 217 BC, Flaminius caught up with the Carthaginian army near Lake Trasimene in central Italy. Hannibal's forces had passed through a narrow defile between the lake and the surrounding hills, and Flaminius, eager to bring him to battle, followed without properly scouting the terrain. It was the last mistake he would ever make. Breathe deeply now, slowly, and let yourself feel the tension of those moments before battle. The Roman legions marching in column along the lakeshore, confident in their numbers and their skill. The morning mist rising from the water, obscuring the hills above. And in those hills, hidden in the fog and brush, 40,000 Carthaginian and Gallic soldiers waiting in absolute silence for the signal to attack. The trap was set, and soon it would spring closed with devastating force. The dawn mist hung thick over Lake Trasimene on that June morning in 217 BC, turning the world into a grey dream where shapes moved like ghosts through the fog. The Roman army of Consul Gaius Flaminius marched along the narrow track between the lake and the hills, their armor clinking softly, their sandaled feet crunching on the gravel path. 25,000 men moved in a long, snaking column, stretched out for miles along the lake shore. They were eager for battle, these Romans. For days they had been chasing Hannibal's army through Etruria, always arriving just after the Carthaginians had moved on, seeing only the smoke of burning farms and the devastation left behind. Now, at last, they had the enemy in sight, camped somewhere ahead beyond this narrow pass. Today, they believed, they would bring Hannibal to battle and end this invasion once and for all. What they did not know was that they were already in the trap. Hannibal had chosen this place with his usual careful attention to terrain and psychology. The path along the northern shore of Trasimene passed through a natural bottleneck, with the lake on one side and steep, wooded hills on the other. An army marching through here would be strung out in column, unable to deploy properly, vulnerable to attack from the high ground. The previous evening, as the Romans made camp several miles back, Hannibal had positioned his army in the hills overlooking the pass. His Spanish and African veterans he placed at the far end where the path opened out into wider ground. They would be visible to the Romans and would serve as bait, drawing the enemy column forward. His Gallic allies and light troops he concealed in the wooded slopes along the pass itself, with strict orders to remain hidden and silent until the signal was given. Now, as dawn broke and the Roman vanguard entered the defile, everything depended on timing and patience. Hannibal watched from the hills, his one good eye studying the enemy column as it flowed like a river into his killing ground. He waited until the entire Roman army was committed to the narrow pass, until there was no easy retreat, until the trap was completely baited. Then he gave the signal. From the hills came the sound of thousands of throats crying out in dozens of languages. The Gauls gave their ululating war cry, the Africans their deep-voiced shout, the Spanish their high-pitched battle scream. And then they were among the Romans, pouring down from the heights like a human avalanche, falling upon the strung-out column with sword and spear and the momentum of their charge. The mist and the surprise were total. The Roman soldiers had no warning, no chance to form their usual disciplined formations. Men who moments before had been marching peacefully suddenly found enemies all around them, cutting them down before they could even draw their weapons. The narrow path became a scene of utter chaos and slaughter. Flaminius, at the head of the column with his staff and the elite troops, heard the sounds of battle behind him and tried to turn his forces around. But it was impossible. The path was too narrow, the confusion too great. His orders could not be heard over the din of combat, and even if they could have been, there was no room to maneuver, no space to form the tight formations that made the legions so formidable. The consul did what any brave Roman would do in such circumstances. He fought. Gathering what men he could around him, Flaminius tried to cut his way toward the sound of heaviest fighting, hoping to rally his disintegrating army. But a Gallic warrior, recognizing the consul by his armor and bearing, rode straight for him through the press of battle. The Gaul's spear took Flaminius in the chest, and the consul fell from his horse, dead before he hit the ground. With their commander dead, the Roman army ceased to exist as a coherent force. It became instead 15,000 individual struggles for survival. Some soldiers tried to fight their way back the way they had come, only to find their retreat blocked by more of Hannibal's troops. Others tried to scale the hills, but the slopes were too steep and the enemy too numerous. Still others plunged into the lake, preferring to take their chances with the water rather than face the swords and spears around them. The slaughter lasted for 3 hours. The morning sun gradually burned away the mist, revealing the full extent of the disaster. The lakeshore was carpeted with bodies, Roman and Carthaginian and Gallic, lying in heaps where they had fallen. The waters of Trasimene ran red with blood, and dead men floated in the shallows, their armor dragging them down into the deep. About 6,000 Romans in the vanguard, those who had already passed through the narrow part of the defile when the ambush began, managed to escape the initial slaughter. They fought their way to higher ground and formed a defensive position. But the next day, surrounded and without hope of relief, they surrendered to Hannibal's cavalry commander, Maharbal. The Battle of Lake Trasimene was one of the largest ambushes in military history. An entire Roman army, 25,000 men, had been destroyed in a single morning. 15,000 Romans lay dead on the field. 10,000 had been captured. Only a few hundred had escaped to carry news of the disaster back to Rome. Hannibal's losses were relatively light, perhaps 1,500 men, mostly Gauls who had been caught up in the fierce close quarters fighting. It was a stunning victory, achieved not through superior numbers or equipment, but through superior planning, timing, and understanding of terrain. Hannibal had not just defeated a Roman army, he had humiliated it, shown that Rome's vaunted legions could be outmaneuvered and destroyed by a clever enemy. After the battle, Hannibal did something that would define his strategy for the rest of the war. He gathered the Roman prisoners and separated them into 2 groups, those who were Roman citizens and those who were Italian allies. The Roman citizens he kept as prisoners to be held for ransom or exchange, but the Italian allies he addressed directly. "I have not come to make war on you," he told them, his voice carrying across the crowd of captive soldiers. "I have come to make war on Rome, to free Italy from Roman tyranny. You are not my enemies. You are Rome's slaves, forced to fight her battles, to die for her ambitions. I offer you freedom. Go home to your cities, tell your people that Hannibal offers alliance and friendship to all who would cast off the Roman yoke." And with that, he released them, all several thousand Italian prisoners, without ransom, without conditions, sending them back to their cities with his message of liberation. It was a brilliant piece of psychological warfare, designed to undermine the Roman alliance system that was the true source of Rome's power. In Rome itself, the news of Trasimene arrived like a thunderbolt. The city went into mourning, with wailing women filling the streets and a palpable sense of panic gripping even the Senate. In 2 battles, Hannibal had destroyed 2 consular armies, killing or capturing perhaps 40,000 Roman soldiers. The roads to Rome itself lay open, seemingly defenseless. The Senate, in their desperation, turned to an ancient institution that had not been used in generations. They appointed a dictator, a single commander with absolute power for 6 months, who would coordinate Rome's defense without the inefficiencies and arguments of dual consuls. The man they chose was Quintus Fabius Maximus, called Cunctator, the Delayer. Fabius was old, cautious, and wise. He understood that Hannibal could not be beaten in open battle, not with Rome's current armies, not with traditional tactics. So he developed a new strategy, one that would frustrate and infuriate many Romans, but would ultimately save the Republic. He would not fight Hannibal. Instead, he would shadow the Carthaginian army, staying always just out of reach, occupying the high ground, cutting off foraging parties, denying Hannibal the decisive battle he sought. He would let time and logistics be his weapons, slowly bleeding the invader through attrition while protecting Rome's remaining strength. Hannibal, meanwhile, marched his army south through central Italy, demonstrating to Rome's allies that they were defenseless, that Rome could not protect them. He ravaged the countryside, but carefully avoided attacking the Latin cities directly, hoping to convince them to defect through fear rather than force. It was a delicate balance, showing his power while not alienating potential allies through excessive cruelty. But the Italians, despite their fear, mostly remained loyal to Rome. The bonds that tied them to the Republic were strong, forged over centuries of shared warfare and intermarriage, reinforced by colonies of Roman citizens planted throughout Italy. Hannibal's strategy of liberation was not working as he had hoped. Still, he pressed on, marching his army down the Adriatic coast, then cutting across to Campania, the rich region around modern Naples. Here were some of the most fertile lands in Italy, and Hannibal's army needed food and rest after their campaigns. The soldiers settled into a comfortable existence, feasting on the abundant harvests, recovering from their wounds, enjoying the mild Italian climate so different from the horrors of the Alps. Fabius followed at a distance, his army always visible on the hilltops, watching but never attacking. When Hannibal tried to bring him to battle, Fabius refused the challenge, withdrawing to stronger positions. When Hannibal sent raiding parties to draw him out, Fabius ignored them, focusing only on his strategic objective: to keep Rome's army intact and deny Hannibal the victory he needed. As summer turned to autumn, Hannibal realized he had made a tactical error. By marching into Campania through a narrow pass, he had trapped himself in a region with limited exits, and Fabius had blocked the main pass with his army. The Roman dictator, usually so cautious, smelled an opportunity to trap and destroy the Carthaginian army without risking a pitched battle. But Hannibal had not survived this long by allowing himself to be outmaneuvered. In one of the most clever ruses of his entire campaign, he devised a plan to escape the trap through deception. His soldiers gathered about 2,000 cattle from the surrounding countryside and attached burning torches to their horns. Then, at night, they drove these cattle up the slopes toward the pass where the Roman army was stationed. From a distance, in the darkness, the moving lights looked like thousands of torches carried by soldiers, as if Hannibal's entire army was making a night march to force the pass. Fabius, not wanting to fight a night battle in unfavorable terrain, withdrew his forces from the pass to higher ground, waiting for daylight to assess the situation. But while the Romans watched the cattle with their burning horns, Hannibal's real army slipped through the now unguarded pass in the darkness, silent and swift. By dawn, they were clear of the trap, and the Romans were left to contemplate their folly. It was a humiliation for Fabius, proof that even caution could be outwitted by genius. The Roman people, already frustrated by Fabius's refusal to fight, now turned against him with renewed vigor. They called him a coward, mocked his defensive strategy, demanded a return to Rome's traditional aggressive tactics. The Senate, responding to public pressure, appointed a master of the horse named Minucius to share command with Fabius, effectively neutering the dictator's power. Minucius, eager to prove himself and win glory, immediately sought battle with Hannibal. He attacked a Carthaginian outpost and achieved a small victory, which he proclaimed as proof that Fabius's caution had been unnecessary. Rome rejoiced, and Minucius's reputation soared. But Hannibal had allowed that victory, had baited another trap. A few days later, he lured Minucius into broken terrain where the Roman army could not deploy properly, and fell upon them with his full strength. The Roman army would have been destroyed if Fabius had not arrived with his own forces, driving Hannibal back and saving his impetuous colleague from disaster. Minucius, humbled by his near destruction, acknowledged Fabius's wisdom and returned authority to the dictator. But Fabius's term was ending, and in the spring of 216 BC, the Romans elected new consuls and raised a massive new army. 8 legions, along with allied troops, a force of about 87,000 men, the largest army Rome had ever fielded. They would no longer delay and shadow. They would confront Hannibal directly and crush him through sheer, overwhelming force. The consuls for 216 BC were Lucius Aemilius Paulus and Gaius Terentius Varro. Paulus was a conservative aristocrat, cautious and experienced, who favored Fabius's strategy of delay. Varro was a populist, the son of a butcher who had risen through talent and ambition and who promised the Roman people the decisive victory they craved. The two consuls, as was Roman custom, alternated command of the army on successive days. It was an absurd system for military command, and Hannibal understood exactly how to exploit it. He would seek battle on Varro's day of command, when the aggressive consul would be eager to fight, rather than on Paulus's day, when the cautious consul would counsel delay. In late July of 216 BC, the two armies converged near the town of Cannae in southeastern Italy. Hannibal's army numbered about 50,000 men, including Gauls, Spanish, Africans, and various other troops he had gathered during his Italian campaigns. He was significantly outnumbered, but he had chosen his ground carefully, a flat plain near the Aufidus River where his superior cavalry would have room to maneuver. The Romans made camp nearby, their massive army a testament to the Republic's determination and resources. On August 1st, with Varro in command, the Romans drew up for battle. It was an intimidating sight, 87,000 men arranged in the classic Roman formation, but deeper and more densely packed than usual, designed to smash through the enemy center by sheer weight and momentum. Hannibal studied the Roman deployment from his position on the last surviving elephant, his one eye taking in every detail. The Romans had done exactly what he expected, what he had planned for. They had concentrated their strength in the center, making their line dense and powerful, but also slow and inflexible. Their cavalry, inferior to his, was positioned on the wings, and Hannibal knew they would not last long against his Numidians and Spanish horsemen. The Carthaginian deployment was unusual, almost bizarre. In the center, he placed his Gallic and Spanish troops in a convex formation, actually bulging toward the enemy. On either side of this center, set back slightly, he placed his African veterans, his best infantry, in two solid blocks. And on the wings, he massed his cavalry, heavily weighted toward his left, where the best horsemen were positioned. It was a formation designed to fail in the center while succeeding everywhere else. The Gauls and Spanish would give ground before the Roman advance, slowly bending back but not breaking, drawing the Roman legions deeper and deeper into the center. Meanwhile, the cavalry would destroy the Roman horse, then sweep around to attack the Roman infantry from behind. And the African veterans, when the time was right, would turn inward, closing the jaws of the trap. It was the perfect battle plan, the culmination of Hannibal's genius, a trap within, a trap that would destroy the largest army Rome had ever assembled. But it all depended on timing, coordination, and the courage of men who would have to retreat while appearing to fight, who would have to give ground without breaking. It was perhaps the most difficult maneuver in all of warfare, and Hannibal was asking his army to perform it against the most disciplined infantry in the world. The battle began with the clash of cavalry on the wings. On Hannibal's left, his heavy Spanish and Gallic cavalry charged into the Roman and Italian horsemen with devastating force. The fighting was brutal and close, men grappling and stabbing, horses biting and kicking. But Hannibal's cavalry was better trained and better led, and within an hour they had routed the Roman horse, driving them from the field. On the right wing, the Numidians engaged in their usual tactics of feints and skirmishes, keeping the Roman allied cavalry busy without fully committing to battle. It was a holding action designed to prevent those horsemen from interfering with the main event unfolding in the center. And in the center, the Roman legions had made contact with Hannibal's Gauls and Spanish. The initial clash was tremendous, the sound of thousands of shields slamming together audible for miles. The Romans pushed forward with their superior numbers and weight, and the Gauls began to give ground, step by step, fighting all the while but slowly retreating. The convex line began to become concave, bending back under the Roman pressure. From above, the battlefield would have looked like a great mouth opening to swallow the Roman army. The legions poured into the gap, convinced they were winning, pushing harder and deeper, compacting themselves as they advanced, becoming a dense mass of men in the center of the field. But now Hannibal's cavalry, having driven off the Roman horse on the left, swept around behind the Roman army. They crashed into the rear of the Roman formation, causing panic and confusion. Romans who had been pushing forward suddenly found themselves attacked from behind, and the rear ranks tried to turn to face this new threat, creating chaos in the packed formations. At the same moment, Hannibal gave the signal, and his African veterans wheeled inward, attacking the flanks of the Roman army from both sides. These were his best troops, fresh and eager, and they fell upon the disorganized Roman flanks with terrible efficiency. The Romans suddenly found themselves surrounded, attacked from front, flanks, and rear simultaneously. Their great strength, their massive numbers, became a liability as men in the center could neither fight nor flee, could only wait helplessly as the circle of death closed around them. The slaughter at Cannae lasted until nightfall. 70,000 Romans died on that field, including the consul Paulus, 80 senators, and countless officers and aristocrats. It was the greatest loss Rome had ever suffered, a catastrophe almost beyond comprehension. Only Varro and about 15,000 men escaped, fleeing the field in scattered groups. Hannibal's losses were perhaps 6,000 men, mostly Gauls who had borne the brunt of the Roman assault in the center. It was an almost perfect victory, a battle that would be studied by military commanders for thousands of years to come. The ultimate example of victory through superior tactics and leadership. After the battle, Hannibal, Hannibal's cavalry commander, came to him with a proposal. "Give me the cavalry," he said, "and in 5 days I will be feasting in the capital at Rome. The city is defenseless, the people are in panic. We can end this war now, tonight." But Hannibal refused. He did not have siege equipment for storming Rome's massive walls. His army, though victorious, was exhausted from the day's fighting, and he still believed that Rome's allies would now defect to him, that Rome could be defeated through attrition and alliance rather than direct assault. Hannibal reportedly replied, "The gods have not given all their gifts to one man. You know how to win a victory, Hannibal, but you do not know how to use one." Whether he actually said this, or whether it was invented by later historians, the sentiment captured a truth. Cannae was Hannibal's greatest victory, but it would also prove to be the high point of his campaign. Let your mind rest now on that ancient battlefield. Feel the stillness after the storm of battle. The sun setting over fields covered with the fallen, the groans of the wounded fading into the night, the victorious army too exhausted even to celebrate. Hannibal stood at the pinnacle of his achievement, having done what no general before or since has managed quite so perfectly. But ahead lay years of campaigning, of slowly diminishing returns, as Rome proved that she could lose every battle and still, ultimately, win the war. After Cannae, the world held its breath, waiting for Rome to collapse. Surely, men thought, no city could survive such a catastrophe. No republic could endure such losses. 70,000 dead in a single day, the flower of Roman manhood cut down, entire families extinguished, villages left without their men. Any other nation would have sued for peace, would have accepted whatever terms the victor demanded. But Rome was not any other nation. When the news reached the city, there was grief, yes, and fear. The wailing of women filled the streets as they learned of fathers, husbands, sons lost forever on that distant field. The Senate met in emergency session, and for a moment some thought about negotiation, about seeking terms, about survival at any cost. But then the old iron of Rome reasserted itself. The Senate decreed that there would be no tears in public, no excessive mourning that might spread panic. They refused to ransom the prisoners Hannibal held, sending a message that Rome would not reward defeat. They raised new legions from boys, too young and old, men too old, armed slaves, and promised them freedom, scraped together every resource the Republic possessed. And they made a sacred vow: they would never surrender, never negotiate with Hannibal while he remained on Italian soil, never give in no matter how many battles they lost. Rome would fight until victory or annihilation, and there would be no middle ground. In the aftermath of Cannae, some of Rome's Italian allies did defect to Hannibal. Most notably, Capua, the second largest city in Italy, opened its gates to the Carthaginians, seduced by promises of becoming the capital of a new Italian confederation. Other cities in southern Italy followed, towns in Apulia, Lucania, and Bruttium, regions that had been conquered by Rome within living memory and still remembered their independence. Syracuse in Sicily, after the death of its pro-Roman king, allied with Carthage. Philip V of Macedon, seeing Rome weakened, signed a treaty with Hannibal, hoping to expand his own power while the Romans were distracted. For a moment, it seemed that Hannibal had achieved his goal, that he had built a coalition that would bring Rome to its knees. But most of Rome's allies remained loyal. The Latins, bound to Rome by blood and culture, never wavered. The Greek cities of southern Italy, remembering the destructive wars between Greek states, preferred Roman stability to Carthaginian promises. And those who might have been tempted to defect were deterred by Roman garrisons and by fear of what Rome would do to traitors once the war was won. Hannibal made Capua his winter headquarters after Cannae, and here his army enjoyed a period of luxury that some historians would blame for their eventual defeat. The soldiers, who had endured such hardships crossing the Alps and fighting across Italy, now found themselves in one of the richest cities in the world, with warm baths, fine food, comfortable beds, and willing women. Some said that the softness of Capua destroyed what the hardships of the mountains could not, that Hannibal's veterans lost their edge during that winter of comfort. But this was perhaps unfair. These men had earned their rest, and when spring came, they would march and fight again with the same skill and courage they had always shown. The real problem was not the luxury of Capua, but the fundamental strategic situation. Hannibal had come to Italy with perhaps 50,000 men. He had lost many in the mountains, in battles, to disease and desertion. He had gained Gallic allies, but they were unreliable and often went home after a campaign season. He received some reinforcements from Carthage, but never enough, as the Carthaginian government was divided between those who supported Hannibal's war and those who opposed it. Meanwhile, Rome's population of citizens and allies was perhaps 3 million people. Even after Cannae, they could raise new armies, and they did, fielding 20 legions or more in the years that followed. These new armies avoided direct confrontation with Hannibal, instead focusing on retaking the cities that had defected, attacking Hannibal's allies, and slowly, methodically, squeezing the strategic space in which the Carthaginian could operate. The Romans also opened new fronts, fighting Carthage's allies rather than Hannibal himself. In Spain, the Scipio brothers, Publius and Gnaeus, waged a successful campaign against Carthaginian forces, preventing reinforcements from reaching Hannibal. In Sicily, Marcus Claudius Marcellus besieged Syracuse, which fell after 2 years despite the defensive genius of Archimedes, the great mathematician who designed weapons to defend his city. Hannibal remained in southern Italy, holding court in Capua and other allied cities, leading his army on campaigns against Roman forces when opportunity offered. He won more battles, smaller ones now, but each victory meant less because Rome simply absorbed the losses and continued fighting. In 215 BC, he defeated a Roman army at the Battle of Nola, though he could not capture the city itself. In 214 BC, he took Tarentum, one of the great Greek cities of southern Italy, though the Romans held the citadel overlooking the harbor. In 212 BC, he attempted to relieve Capua, which was under siege by Roman forces, but he could not break through the Roman siege lines. He tried a desperate gambit then, marching his army rapidly toward Rome itself, hoping to draw the Roman armies away from Capua. He rode up to the very gates of Rome, so close that he reportedly threw a javelin over the walls into the city. But Rome did not panic, did not recall her armies to defend the capital. The walls were strong, and the Romans trusted them. Hannibal had to turn back, and Capua fell to the Romans shortly thereafter. The siege had been brutal, and Rome's vengeance was terrible. The leading citizens of Capua were executed, the population was enslaved or scattered, and the city was reduced to a village. It was a message to any other cities thinking of defecting. Rome would forgive much, but never treachery. In 211 BC, Hannibal's situation deteriorated further. His brother Hasdrubal in Spain decided to march to Italy with reinforcements, following the same route Hannibal had taken over the Alps. If Hasdrubal could unite his army with Hannibal's, together they might have the strength to finally break Rome's resistance. Hasdrubal successfully crossed the Alps in 207 BC with about 30,000 men, a smaller force than Hannibal's original army but still significant. He marched down into Italy, and Hannibal prepared to move north to join him. For a moment, Rome's strategic nightmare seemed about to come true. 2 Carthaginian armies operating in Italy, able to coordinate and support each other. But the Romans had learned much about warfare in the years since Hannibal's arrival. They intercepted Hasdrubal's messengers to Hannibal, learning his brother's plans and location. Then the consul Gaius Claudius Nero, commanding an army shadowing Hannibal in the south, made a bold decision. He took 7,000 of his best men and marched them north at forced pace, covering 250 miles in 7 days. He joined his colleague Marcus Livius near the Metaurus River, where Hasdrubal's army was camped, doubling the Roman force without Hasdrubal knowing reinforcements had arrived. The Battle of the Metaurus was fought on a dark, rainy day in 207 BC. Hasdrubal, realizing too late that he faced a larger Roman army than expected, tried to withdraw, but the Romans forced him to give battle. The fighting was fierce and close, and for a time the outcome was uncertain. But then Nero, commanding the Roman right wing, saw that his opposite flank was stalled by difficult terrain. Rather than waste time in a static fight, he led his troops behind the Roman lines, marching around to the other end of the battlefield, and fell upon the rear of the Carthaginian left wing. It was the same maneuver Hannibal had used at Cannae, now turned against a Carthaginian army. Hasdrubal's army collapsed under the double assault. More than half his men were killed or captured. Hasdrubal himself, seeing that all was lost, rode directly into the thick of the Roman lines, seeking death in battle rather than capture and humiliation. He fell with a sword in his hand, dying as he had lived, a warrior and a member of the Barca family. The Romans took Hasdrubal's head and threw it into Hannibal's camp. When the Carthaginian general saw his brother's severed head, he reportedly said, "I see there the fate of Carthage." He knew then that he would never receive the reinforcements he needed, that his years in Italy had been for nothing, that slowly but inevitably Rome was winning the war. For the next 4 years, Hannibal remained in southern Italy, holding what territory he could, fighting occasional skirmishes, but unable to achieve any decisive result. His army dwindled through attrition, disease, and desertion. The Gallic allies went home, tired of a war that brought them nothing but hardship. The Italian cities that had allied with him were retaken by Rome one by one, and Hannibal could not prevent it. Meanwhile, in Spain, a young Roman commander was achieving remarkable success. This was Publius Cornelius Scipio, the son and nephew of the Scipios who had died fighting in Spain, the same young man who had saved his wounded father at the Ticinus River years before, is less than #0. 5 is greater than he had been given command in Spain at the unprecedented age of 25, and he proved worthy of the trust. Scipio studied Hannibal's tactics carefully, learned from them, adapted them to Roman capabilities. He defeated the Carthaginian armies in Spain one by one, capturing New Carthage in a brilliant surprise assault, winning major battles at Baecula and Ilipa through clever use of maneuver and psychological warfare. By 206 BC, Spain was lost to Carthage, and Scipio returned to Rome a hero. The young commander proposed a bold strategy. Rather than continuing to fight Hannibal in Italy, why not invade Africa and threaten Carthage itself? If Carthage was under attack, They would have to recall Hannibal to defend their homeland. The war could be ended not by defeating Hannibal in Italy, which had proven impossible, but by forcing him to leave. In 204 BC, Scipio landed in Africa with an army of about 30,000 men. He immediately allied with Numidia's king Massinissa, an enemy of Carthage, giving him access to the superb Numidian cavalry that had served Hannibal so well. He defeated several Carthaginian armies in the field, laying waste to the countryside around Carthage itself. In Carthage, panic set in. The city that had sent Hannibal to ravage Italy now faced the same fate herself. The Carthaginian Senate debated frantically and finally sent the message they had delayed for so many years: Hannibal must come home. In the summer of 203 BC, after 15 years in Italy, Hannibal received the recall order. He was now 44 years old, no longer the vigorous young general who had crossed the Alps, but still formidable, still the greatest tactical mind of his age. He read the message and understood what it meant. His grand strategy had failed, his years of victories had achieved nothing lasting, and now he must return to fight for Carthage's very survival. He gathered his remaining troops, perhaps 15,000 veterans who had followed him through every campaign. These men had survived the Alps, Trebia, Trasimene, Cannae, and a dozen smaller battles. They had spent their youth in Italy, fighting Rome's endless armies, winning victory after victory that somehow never brought the war any closer to an end. Before leaving Italy, Hannibal sacrificed all his horses that were too old or injured to make the sea voyage to Africa. He reportedly wept as he did this, knowing that many of these animals had carried him through his greatest triumphs. Then he boarded ship with his remaining army and sailed for Carthage, leaving behind the land he had terrorized for 15 years but never quite conquered. The final confrontation came in October of 202 BC at a place called Zama, about 5 days' march southwest of Carthage. Hannibal commanded perhaps 45,000 men, including his Italian veterans, newly raised Carthaginian troops, and 80 war elephants. Scipio had about 35,000 men, but crucially, he had Massinissa's Numidian cavalry, the same type of horsemen who had won so many victories for Hannibal. Before the battle, the two generals met face to face to discuss peace terms. It must have been an extraordinary moment. Hannibal, the old master, weathered by years of campaigning, facing Scipio, the young student who had learned his lessons perhaps too well. They talked for an hour, each taking the measure of the other, but they could not reach agreement, and they returned to their armies, knowing that only battle would settle the issue. The Battle of Zama began with Hannibal sending his elephants forward in a massive charge designed to disrupt the Roman formation. But Scipio had prepared for this. He had trained his men to open lanes in their formation, allowing the elephants to pass harmlessly through, while others blew trumpets and clashed their weapons, frightening the beasts so they turned and stampeded back through their own lines. The infantry clashed next, and here the battle was evenly matched. Hannibal's veterans from Italy fought magnificently, holding their ground against the Roman legions. But the newly raised Carthaginian troops were not equal to the Romans in skill or discipline, and they began to give way. The decisive moment came on the wings, where Massiniss's Numidians drove off the Carthaginian cavalry. Then, in a mirror of Cannae, the victorious cavalry swept around and attacked the Carthaginian infantry from behind, surrounding them just as Hannibal had surrounded the Romans 16 years before. The Carthaginian army was destroyed. 20,000 men died on the field, and nearly as many were captured. Hannibal himself escaped with a small group of cavalry, riding through the night back to Carthage with the bitter taste of defeat, his first and last defeat in open battle. Carthage sued for peace, and the terms were harsh. They would pay enormous tribute to Rome for 50 years, surrender all but 10 of their warships, give up all territory outside Africa, and agree never to make war without Rome's permission. It was the end of Carthage as a great power, the final chapter in the story of Rome's most dangerous enemy. Hannibal remained in Carthage for a time, serving as a civilian magistrate, trying to rebuild his broken nation. But Rome never forgot him, never stopped fearing him. When his enemies in Carthage accused him of plotting another war, Rome demanded his surrender. Rather than face Roman chains, Hannibal fled into exile in 195 BC, finding refuge with various eastern kingdoms that still defied Rome. He served as a military advisor to Antiochus III of Syria, helping plan a war against Rome. But the eastern kings were not the disciplined soldiers of Carthage, and Antiochus was defeated at the Battle of Magnesia in 190 BC. The terms of peace included the surrender of Hannibal, and once again he fled, this time to the kingdom of Bithynia on the Black Sea coast. There he remained for several years, far from the lands he had fought over, far from Carthage and Rome and the life he had known. He was an old man now, nearly 70, his warrior's body bent with age and old wounds, his one good eye dimming. But Rome's fear of him never dimmed, and eventually Roman agents tracked him even to this distant corner of the world. In 183 BC, when he learned that Roman soldiers were coming to arrest him, Hannibal took poison. He had always carried it with him, a final insurance against capture and humiliation. His last words were reported to be, "Let us free the Romans from the anxiety they have so long experienced, since they think it tries their patience too much to wait for an old man's death." And so died Hannibal Barca, son of Hamilcar, the man who had sworn as a child never to be Rome's friend, who had crossed the Alps with elephants, who had won victory after victory against the mightiest power in the Mediterranean world, but who had ultimately failed in his grand objective. He died in exile, by his own hand, far from everything he had fought for. His legacy, though, would endure far beyond his death. Military commanders, for thousands of years, would study his tactics, particularly the double envelopment at Cannae, still considered one of the most perfect battles in military history. His crossing of the Alps would become legendary, a testament to what determination and genius could accomplish against impossible odds. And Rome, despite defeating him, was forever changed by the experience. The Second Punic War had lasted 17 years and cost hundreds of thousands of lives. It had brought Rome to the brink of destruction, had tested the Republic's strength, and found it barely sufficient. The Romans learned lessons from Hannibal about strategy, tactics, and the importance of securing allies. More profoundly, the war changed Rome's character. Before Hannibal, Rome had been one power among many in the Mediterranean world. After defeating him, Rome was determined never again to face such an existential threat. They would conquer rather than merely defend, would dominate rather than coexist. The Roman Empire that would eventually span from Britain to Mesopotamia was born in the crucible of the war against Hannibal. Carthage itself survived for another 50 years after Hannibal's death, paying its tribute to Rome, living quietly under Roman dominance. But Rome could not forget, could not forgive. The old senator Cato the Elder ended every speech in the Roman Senate with the phrase "Carthago delenda est," Carthage must be destroyed. In 149 BC, Rome found a pretext for war, besieging Carthage for 3 years in what would be called the Third Punic War. The Carthaginians defended their city with desperate courage, but they had no Hannibal to lead them, no allies to support them, no hope of victory. In 146 BC, the Romans finally broke through the walls, fought through the city street by street, and destroyed everything. They killed or enslaved the population, burned the buildings to the ground, and reportedly sowed salt into the earth so nothing would grow there again. The great city of Carthage, which had stood for 700 years, which had sent colonies across the Mediterranean, which had produced Hannibal Barca, was erased from the earth. Only ruins remained, and eventually even the ruins were buried by sand and time. Yet the memory persisted. Long after Carthage was dust, long after Rome itself had fallen to barbarian invasions, the story of Hannibal's march endured. Medieval scholars read about it in the works of Livy and Polybius. Renaissance generals tried to emulate his tactics. Napoleon studied his campaigns and called him the greatest general in history. Modern military academies still teach Cannae as the perfect battle. What made Hannibal so remarkable was not just his tactical genius, though that was considerable. It was his vision, his willingness to attempt the impossible, his understanding that war is as much about psychology and strategy as it is about killing the enemy. He saw that Rome's strength lay not in her legions, but in her alliance system, and he tried to break it. He understood that sometimes the direct route is the wrong route, that the difficult path can be the winning path. He was also remarkable for his relationship with his soldiers. In an age when generals were often aristocrats who commanded from a distance, Hannibal shared every hardship with his men. He ate what they ate, slept where they slept, endured the same cold and heat and danger. His soldiers would follow him anywhere because they knew he would never ask them to do anything he wouldn't do himself. And yet, for all his genius, he failed. He won every battle but lost the war. He brought Rome to her knees, but could not deliver the killing blow. In the end, Rome's advantages in population, resources, and political will prove more decisive than Hannibal's brilliance on the battlefield. Perhaps this is the real lesson of Hannibal's story, that individual genius, while important, is not enough to overcome structural advantages. That tactics matter, but strategy matters more. That winning battles is not the same as winning wars. That sometimes the underdog's heroic effort, while inspiring and worthy of remembrance, still ends in defeat. Or perhaps the lesson is simply that some stories are worth telling regardless of how they end, that the journey matters as much as the destination, that the courage to attempt the impossible has its own value, even in failure, that Hannibal's crossing of the Alps, his years of victories against impossible odds, his refusal to surrender even when all hope was lost, represents something essential about the human spirit. As you drift toward sleep now, let your mind wander through the story we have followed together. See young Hannibal in the temple, swearing his oath before the gods. Watch the army crossing the Rhone, the elephants swimming with their trunks raised above the water. Feel the terrible cold of the Alps, the relief of descending into Italy's warmth. Hear the clash of bronze on bronze at Trebia, Trasimene, Cannae. See the years passing, the victories that meant less and less, the slow realization that Rome would not break, could not be broken by force alone. Watch Hannibal sailing away from Italy after 15 years, leaving behind the land he had conquered, but never quite subdued. See him standing at Zama, facing the student who had learned his lessons too well, experiencing defeat for the first time in his long career. And finally, see him as an old man in Bithynia, so far from home, holding the poison that would free him from Rome's vengeance one last time. He had kept his oath. He had never been Rome's friend. He had fought them for nearly 4 decades, had brought them closer to destruction than they would ever come again, had earned their fear and respect even in defeat. The Carthaginian terror is gone now, turned to dust like Carthage itself. The elephants are gone, the armies, the cities they fought over. Even Rome, that eternal city, eventually fell to time and conquest. But the story remains, preserved in old texts, studied in modern classrooms, told in different forms across the ages. It remains because it speaks to something timeless in us, the desire to overcome impossible odds, to attempt what others say cannot be done, to leave a mark upon the world that will outlast our brief time in it. Hannibal did not conquer Rome, but he did achieve a kind of immortality. 22 centuries after his death, we still speak his name, still marvel at his achievements, still wonder what might have been if he had marched on Rome after Cannae, if his brother had reached him before the Metaurus, if Carthage had supported him more fully. But history is not written in if, but in what was. And what was is this: a boy swore an oath, became a man, led an army over mountains that had never been crossed, won victories that should have been impossible, fought for his people and his dream, and in the end, lost. But he lost magnificently, heroically, in a way that made even his enemies admire him, that made them tell his story to their children and their children's children. As you sink deeper into sleep, let the images fade gently away. The ancient battles, the snow-covered mountains, the Mediterranean sun on ancient stones, all fading into the comfortable darkness of rest. Let the story settle in your mind like sediment in a quiet pool, there to be remembered in dreams or waking thoughts, a connection to those distant days when giants walked the earth and changed the course of history. Sleep well and remember, every great journey begins with a single step, even if that step takes you across the Alps with elephants. Every great deed begins with determination, even if the final outcome is not what you hoped. And every story worth telling has at its heart someone who refused to accept the word impossible, who tried anyway, who left us an example to follow or at least to contemplate as we face our own mountains, our own challenges, our own oaths sworn in the temples of youth. The Carthaginian terror has passed into legend now, where perhaps it always belonged. But legends have power, the power to inspire and instruct, to comfort and challenge, to carry us through the dark hours toward the dawn. May this legend carry you gently into peaceful sleep, and may you wake refreshed, ready to face whatever Alps lie before you, whatever Rome opposes you, with courage and determination, and the knowledge that some stories are worth living, even if we cannot know their endings. Rest now. The story is told. The ancient world sleeps, and so should you. Good night, dear traveler.